From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This project, the administration is moving forward as the first step toward turning Arctic Alaska into a sacrifice zone like what they have done to the Gulf of Mexico. It jeopardizes the indigenous food security, it threatens the ecological diversity of the Arctic seas, and it really creates a problem for mitigating the climate crisis.
For the first time, the Trump administration has approved a plan for a company to drill for oil in federal waters in the Arctic Ocean off Alaska. We'll speak with Subhankar Banerjee, leading Arctic photographer and conservationist. Then, as the Mariana Islands recover from the strongest storm to hit the United States since 1935, we go to the Florida Panhandle, which was just devastated by Hurricane Michael. We'll speak to the owner of the Sand Palace, one of the few homes still standing in Mexico Beach.
I believe in the Bible. I also believe in science. And I don't know what all causes these storms to be so frequent now and so ferocious, but I did read Albert Gore's book 25 years ago, and it made sense.
Then the Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida has virtually been turned to rubble by Hurricane Michael. At least 17 F-22 stealth fighter jets, amounting to about $6 billion, were damaged or destroyed in the storm. Finally, in the wake of the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, we look at how elite U.S. universities are facing new scrutiny over their close ties to Saudi Arabia. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Authorities are continuing to investigate suspicious packages containing homemade bomb devices targeting high-profile Democrats, as well as the CNN News Network. Investigators say the bombs may have originated in southern Florida and were sent through the U.S. Postal Service. The 10 packages being examined had a return address of Florida. Congressmember Debbie Wasserman Schultz. 3 packages were intercepted Thursday, 2 headed for former Vice President Joe Biden in Delaware, and a third to actor Robert De Niro here in Manhattan. Other targets of the packages: billionaire philanthropist George Soros, the Obamas, the Clintons, Congressmember Maxine Waters, former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, and former CIA Chief John Brennan, whose package was delivered to CNN. This is FBI Assistant Director William Sweeney.
What I can say is that at various times over the last few days, 10 suspicious packages were located at multiple locations in New York, Maryland, Florida, Delaware, and Los Angeles. Law enforcement responded, and each package was collected by experts, and examinations are now underway at the FBI lab in Quantico. As to the devices located in New York, which contained a powder, the initial analysis indicates that the powder in those particular envelopes did not present a biological threat. Other analysis is ongoing.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is urging Saudi Arabia to disclose who ordered the murder of the Saudi journalist, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, as well as the identity of a local cooperator involved in the murder plot. Erdogan also said Turkey has more information about the case than it's shared so far, suggesting he could release more details if the Saudis refuse to reveal vital information. This comes as Saudi Arabia admitted Khashoggi's killing was in fact premeditated, contradicting the Saudis' earlier claims he died as a result of a fistfight gone awry. Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor is set to meet with Turkish prosecutors Sunday as part of the ongoing investigation. Meanwhile, the United Nations is calling for an international investigation into the murder. This is UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Agnes Callamard, speaking at the UN Thursday.
It is not quite possible for the state to wash its hands from the behavior of those actors, whether or not somebody even higher up has requested those acts. You know, where do we stop where do we begin? Where do we stop our construction of the state? They were representing the state when they acted as they acted. The state cannot wash its hands from its responsibilities.
Meanwhile, back in the United States, CIA Director Gina Haspel has briefed President Trump on a recent trip to Istanbul, where she reportedly listened to the audio tape of Khashoggi's murder. Salah bin Jamal Khashoggi, the son of the murdered journalist, has arrived in the United States with his family after being allowed to leave Saudi Arabia. Although he's a dual U.S.-Saudi citizen, he had previously been restricted from traveling by Saudi Arabia. This comes as the Saudi investment conference known as Davos in the Desert wraps up in Riyadh, where deals reportedly worth at least $56 billion were made, despite many high-profile company heads and political figures supposedly boycotting the event, though many sent the people they supervise. We'll have more on Saudi Arabia's financial ties with the U.S. later in the show. In immigration news, President Trump's continuing to escalate his attacks against the Central American caravan heading toward the U.S.-Mexico border. President Trump is planning to deploy up to 1,000 additional troops to the border. He's also reportedly considering using executive action to shut down entry into the United States through the southern border altogether, a move that would be similar to his 2017 travel ban, widely known as the Muslim ban. This comes after Trump admitted he had no evidence to back up his claims that terrorists from the Middle East and gang members were among those traveling with the caravan of asylum seekers. Many are fleeing widespread violence and poverty in Honduras. Olympic gold medalist, reality TV show star Caitlyn Jenner has revoked her support for President Trump after the Trump administration announced plans to narrow the legal definition of gender to an individual's biological sex at birth. Jenner had previously supported President Trump, but in a new op-ed for the Washington Post titled, "I thought Trump would help trans people. I was wrong." She wrote, quote, "The reality is that the trans community is being relentlessly attacked by this president. He has made trans people into political pawns as he whips up animus against us in an attempt to energize the most right-wing segment of his party, claiming his anti-transgender policies are meant to protect the country," Jenner said. In environmental news, the Trump administration announced Wednesday its approval of a plan to drill for oil off the Alaskan coast. Hillcore Energy's proposal to drill in the Beaufort Sea would be the first oil and gas production facility in federal waters off Alaska. Meanwhile, France has approved a plan by oil company Total to start drilling off the coast of French Guiana, which is located in the North Atlantic coast of South America. Environmental groups condemn the plan, raising concerns over threats to the region's biodiversity. We'll have more on the proposed oil drilling off Alaska's coast after headlines with conservationist Subhankar Banerjee. In South Carolina, 2 sheriff's deputies were fired Wednesday for their role in the deaths of 2 women who drowned in a van overcome by floodwaters from Hurricane Florence while in law enforcement's custody last month. The 2 officers who were also in the van transporting the women to a mental health facility survived. 45-year-old Wendy Newton and 43-year-old Nicolette Green had gone to hospitals when they were involuntarily committed and detained. An investigation into their deaths is ongoing. To see our full coverage of the story, go to democracynow.org. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley has asked the Justice Department to investigate lawyer Michael Avenatti and his client Julie Swetnick for possibly making false statements to Congress about Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh attempting to obstruct the Senate investigation into Kavanaugh. Swetnick wrote an official statement to the Judiciary Committee accusing Kavanaugh of attending parties in the 80s where he would help get women drunk who were then gang raped. Grassley said that contradictions in her story require further investigation. In response, Michael Avenatti tweeted, "Let's start the investigation tonight. I will make my client available for a sworn interview, and you can make Judge Kavanaugh available for a sworn interview. We also have 9 other witnesses we want interviewed and specific documents we want requested. Let's go," Avenatti said. The Guardian reporter who was body slammed by Montana Congressmember Greg Gianforte last year is threatening to withdraw from their settlement if the Republican Congressmember continues to lie about the attack. Congressmember Gianforte pled guilty to body slamming Ben Jacobs and settled with him after agreeing to make a donation to the Committee to Protect Journalists and acknowledging he assaulted Jacobs unprovoked. However, Gianforte recently made comments to a local paper defending his earlier story to the police that Jacobs initiated the attack. Gianforte is currently running for re-election. Last week, President Trump praised him at a Montana rally for the assault, saying, quote, "Any guy that can do a body slam, he's my kind of guy." In Europe, NATO forces have launched the biggest war games since the end of the Cold War amidst escalating tensions between NATO and Russia. About 50,000 soldiers from 31 countries are participating in the mock battle in Norway. This comes as Poland says the U.S. is welcome to station medium-range missiles in Poland and that it supports President Trump's decision to withdraw from the 1987 Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. Experts warn Trump's decision to withdraw from the landmark treaty could spark a new arms race. President Trump imposed new sanctions against Hezbollah on Thursday. The restrictions will ratchet up financial sanctions against Hezbollah, as well as sanctions on companies or individuals who support its fundraising. AIPAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, had lobbied for the increased sanctions against Hezbollah, which the United States has branded a terrorist organization. In Ethiopia, lawmakers appointed the country's first female president Thursday. Sahlawork Zewde is a high-level diplomat who served as head of the African Union prior to her presidential appointment and is currently the only woman president in Africa. Earlier this month, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed unveiled his new cabinet, appointing women to a record 50% of positions. In Spain, thousands marched in the capital, Madrid, Thursday to protest plans to bury the remains of former Spanish dictator General Francisco Franco in the city's Almudena Cathedral. Franco's family is seeking to move his remains to the Madrid landmark despite government and public objections.
If it were up to me, I'd chuck him in a ditch, like hundreds of Spaniards. In a ditch, yes, but not here.
Franco led Spain as a military dictatorship from 1939 to 1975 after his forces claimed victory in the brutal Spanish Civil War, which killed 500,000 people. During his rule, he suppressed political opposition through extrajudicial killings, abductions, and forced labor. In Britain, the country's data watchdog hit Facebook with the maximum possible fine for failing to protect users' personal data in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The fine is equal to $650,000, a fraction of the possible $22 million it might have been if the breach had occurred after European Union's new data protection laws went into effect. The watchdog found Facebook gave app developers access to personal information of some 87 million users without their knowledge or consent. The political consultancy group Cambridge Analytica then used the data to sway voters to support President Trump during the 2016 campaign. Back in the United States in Hartford, Connecticut, community members gathered Wednesday in front of ICE offices to ask for a stay of deportation for Nelson Pinos, an Ecuadorian man who has been living in sanctuary at the First and Summerfield United Methodist Church in New Haven, Connecticut for the past year. He's been in the United States for over a quarter of a century and lives with his wife and 3 children. And in Pennsylvania, Move member Mike Africa Sr. has been granted parole, released from prison after a decades-long campaign to win his freedom. On Tuesday morning, Mike Africa walked free after more than 40 years behind bars and reunited with his wife, Debbie Africa, and his son, Mike Africa Jr. Both Mike and Debbie were arrested during a massive police raid on the Philadelphia Move House in 1978, during which one police officer was killed. Debbie was released in June. This is Mike Africa Jr. speaking about his father during an exclusive Democracy Now! Interview in August alongside his mother, Debbie.
My father was my first hero. My father is Mike Africa. Man, to be his son is one of the biggest honors that I've ever had to experience. And just like thinking about him and the kind of person he is and the effort that he puts into being right and the love that he has for his family.
The remaining 7 members of the Move 9 who were arrested in 1978 remain behind bars. To see the whole Democracy Now! Interview with Debbie and Mike Africa Jr., go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with the historic announcement by the Trump administration this week to approve a plan to drill for oil off the Alaskan coast. On Wednesday, Department of the Interior approved Hillcore Energy proposal to drill in the Beaufort Sea 6 miles off the Alaskan coast. It would be the first oil and gas production facility in federal waters in Alaska. Hillcore plans to build a 9-acre artificial island about 20 miles east of Prudhoe Bay, not far from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Dubbed the Liberty Project, the operation plans to extract about 70,000 barrels of oil per day on the state's North Slope. This latest move continues the Trump administration's targeting of the Alaskan Arctic. Last year, legislation to allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was quietly added to the Republican tax code overhaul. In January, the White House proposed a massive offshore oil and gas drilling plan to allow it in nearly all federal waters, including sails off the Alaska coast. The Arctic Refuge is rich in biodiversity and home to caribou, polar bears, and musk oxen. Millions of migratory birds gather there from across the world. Whales reside just offshore. It's also been home to generations of indigenous people for thousands of years. We're joined now by Professor Subhankar Banerjee, activist, photographer, professor of art and ecology at the University of New Mexico, author of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Seasons of Life and Land, and editor of Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point. His work is included in the exhibition Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment at Princeton University Art Museum. Professor Banerjee, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of this week's Trump announcement.
Thank you, Amy, for having me, and I bring you warm greetings from all my indigenous and non-indigenous brothers and sisters who are working very hard right now to defend the Arctic. So this is what we would call ushering in a new era to open up the Arctic seas of Alaska to oil and gas development. So this is one first small step, but a significant one. You started with saying Hurricane Michael and the impact that it had on Florida and all of the hurricanes we had last year. The extreme warming in the Arctic is directly related to the climate breakdown that is happening all over the planet right now, because the Arctic is a critical integrator of our planet's climate system, atmospheric and oceanic, and it is warming extremely rapidly. So what does this decision then mean? Is instead of helping to mitigate the climate crisis, they are turning the Arctic Ocean and all of Arctic Alaska into a petroscape, oil, gas, coal, and all of these. But I want to take you back a little bit historically. So what this decision does, this is a conditional approval, meaning it is not entirely, they can't move forward. They still need a whole bunch of other permits before they can move forward to start the Liberty Project. The whole sort of exploration of the Arctic seas of Alaska started in the 1970s, and there have been two kind of waves. And it went on till about early 1990s when no major discovery was made. So President George H.W. Bush canceled the entire exploration program for the Arctic seas of Alaska. The junior Bush, the son, revived that. And ever since then, so anything that is taking place in Arctic seas of Alaska right now, we should look at it, not just what President Trump is doing, but as a continuation from Bush to Obama to Trump. President Obama supported offshore drilling for basically most of his presidency, except the last days of his administration. So if this one moves forward, what does this mean? So they'll build, it's not technically a full offshore platform, like a floating platform, but it is an island they'll build, and then there is a pipeline that will connect the mainland to this island. Whereas a full offshore, the Chukchi Sea that they're planning would be like 60, 70 miles offshore, which is a whole different thing. But all of this threatens the indigenous food security, the incredible diversity that you spoke of the marine life in those Arctic seas, and it is very close to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which we are now trying to defend.
Hillcore Energy plans to build this 9-acre gravel island not far from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the world's last pristine wildernesses. This is Guchan tribal government member Samuel Alexander testifying during a Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources hearing.
When we talk about the refuge, we talk about the land. It is tied to our language and our understanding of the world. And, you know, the Wadzai, the caribou, we are connected to them, and we recognize that. You know, I hear this talk about development all the time. We need to develop this, we need to develop that. What I think we need is a little bit of understanding of the sustainability of the life that we live as Gwich'in. All right? We're not sitting here asking for anything. We're not saying we need hospitals, we need schools, we need all these things. We're not saying give us money. What we're saying is let us live as Gwich'in.
So that is Gwich'in tribal government member Samuel Alexander. Talk about how this fits into Trump's plan for energy development.
So Trump has initiated what he calls the energy dominance. And Secretary Zinke last year said that energy dominance, the path to that energy dominance will come through the state of Alaska. So they have initiated a full-on war on Alaska's Arctic, on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, on the Arctic Ocean, as well as in Tashapak Lake, all of which are threatened right now. Sam Alexander spoke about, Gwich'in leader spoke about actually indigenous food security, and he gave a very beautiful speech last year. And right now, the Gwich'in Nation on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, along with the environmental allies, are really trying very hard. Any day now, the Trump administration will release regarding the Arctic Refuge what is called the Exploration Environmental Assessment any day now. So they plan to do seismic exploration threatening the Denning polar bears, the endangered polar bears, in the Arctic Refuge coastal plain this winter. They'll release that any day now. Right after that, in mid-November, we are expecting a draft environmental impact statement on the lease sale that they propose to offer next summer. A process that should have taken 3 to 5 years. They are packing it in a 1 year. So they are fast-tracking it, they are undermining environmental regulations, and we are fighting it hard. So there is a very large coalition of indigenous human rights and environmental groups, both in U.S. and Canada, are fighting all of this now.
And again, Hilcor's track record.
And Hilcor, the company that is proposing to build this Liberty project, has a horrendous track record of pipeline spills in the southeast of Alaska, in the Cook Inlet, as well as in Gulf of Mexico. And right now, this was not reported in the Washington Post, they are asking for a waiver of the corrosion protection on that pipeline. So that's why I'm saying that it's not a done deal yet. There are various permits that Hilcor still has to get. The company has a horrendous record. And as we all know that they have turned the Gulf of Mexico into basically a garbage dump and a sacrifice zone, that's what they're actually basically ushering in for the Arctic Ocean. And we will fight it very hard.
Shubhankar Banerjee is professor of art and ecology at the University of New Mexico. He is author of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Seasons of Life and Land, and editor of Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point. When we come back, the effects of Hurricane Michael on the Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle that housed about 50 F-22 fighter jets. We'll talk about what's happened to them. Stay with us. Tundra Chant by Bumua. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, Vice President Mike Pence traveled to the Tyndall Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, just over a week after the base was largely destroyed during Hurricane Michael. The base is the home of a fleet of 55 F-22 stealth fighters. Before Hurricane Michael leveled the base, at least 33 of these jets were flown to safety to Ohio. But at least 17 of the planes, costing about $250 million each, $339 million each, were likely left behind and possibly destroyed because they weren't airworthy at the time. There are several air bases located right on the coast in storm-prone areas in states in the South where scientists anticipate climate change-induced hurricanes will grow more intense and more frequent. But on Thursday, Vice President Pence vowed to rebuild the entire base. To talk more about this issue, we're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Dave Phillips, national correspondent for the New York Times. One of his recent pieces headlined "Exposed by Michael: Climate Threat to Warplanes at Coastal Bases." Dave, welcome back to Democracy Now! As you join us from Colorado. Can you talk about what you understand happened at Tyndall?
Sure. Well, as we know, Hurricane Michael, when it developed very fast and got much bigger than was predicted, and I think it really caught the Air Force off guard. So for decades, what the Air Force has done, and also the Navy and the Army Marines, who all have their own aircraft, what they've done when one of their airfields is in harm's way is fire up the planes and fly them off to safety. In this case, at Tyndall, they flew most of their F-22s to an Air Force base in Ohio. And that works if you can get your planes started. But the F-22 is a very sophisticated and somewhat finicky plane, and according to Air Force reports, only about half of them are mission ready at any one time. And so with only a couple days notice of this impending storm, they weren't able to get, we're hearing 17 planes going. And so they put them in hangars on the base and they hoped for the best. And the best did not happen. When Hurricane Michael hit the coast, it hit directly on Tyndall Air Force Base, and the winds there were measured up to 130 miles an hour before the base's wind speed measuring equipment broke. So we really don't know how ferocious the storm really was. But afterwards, the base was flattened. Many of its hangars had their roofs ripped off. Buildings were flooded. I think the Air Force, in its assessment is saying that base is almost a complete loss. And these planes that were left behind, the Air Force is being very careful about what it says about it, but they say that many of them are damaged.
Many of these believed to be, 17 F-22s?
17, which is worth somewhere around $5.8 billion, depending on how you count it. Compare that to replacing the entire base, which would only cost about $1.5 billion by the Air Force's estimation. So these planes are literally irreplaceable and also just a tremendous cost.
I mean, you think about this. President Trump has been talking about a caravan of immigrants coming up from Honduras, making its way through Mexico, talking about it as a threat to national security. If people learned that there was an Air Force base on the southern border that was almost leveled, that perhaps 17 of its leading jet fighter planes destroyed, people would say, who did that? Who is the enemy? In fact, what we're talking about, talk about the elements of this storm that relate to climate change. The fact that they couldn't move these planes that simply weren't airworthy at the time, but if they had time, the intensity, the frequency, how fast Michael hit the panhandle.
Well, that's right. I think so. The Air Force has been dealing with dangerous storms that damaged its bases since the time when, the destruction was measured in blimps. They're used to it, and I think they think that it is a cost of doing business. There's many reasons that the military wants to have airfields down on the coast in the southeastern United States. The question is, how do those costs change if and when storms become more frequent, when they become stronger, and when the storm surge that comes in becomes higher. And I think because there is uncertainty here, they don't know what to prepare for and how bad it's going to get. But I think Tyndall was really a wake-up call because it showed how vulnerable they really are.
What about Vice President Pence going to the base and saying they're going to rebuild Tyndall?
I think that you can argue that in some cases rebuilding these bases could make sense if you do it right. Having bases on the coast is helpful for a couple reasons. One, you want to be able to patrol your borders. We sort of take it for granted that we have peaceful borders right now, but that may not always be the case. And two, the Air Force and all of the services have to do a lot of training. Their aircraft are really loud. Sometimes they're shooting missiles and shooting down drones, and they need an empty place to do it. And most of the empty places that they use are over the ocean. So it's hard to just say, well, why don't you move your bases to Ohio or Kansas or Arizona? So the question is, if you want to stay, what do you have to do? The Air Force actually has a case study of this. It has an Air Force base on Guam, and that Pacific island is right in the middle of Typhoon Alley. You were talking earlier in the show about the super typhoon that just hit. Well, those types of typhoons have hit Guam repeatedly over the years. And what they've done is they've hardened the structures there almost, as if they were expecting them to get bombed. Their hangars are built out of heavy steel and concrete. Even the base housing there is built out of concrete so that it can withstand winds over 150 miles an hour, sometimes up to 200. That type of thing can work, but it takes investment. One of these hangars could cost $100 million. And I think that the problem is whether the military will invest. Are they going to get serious about this stuff, and will they have support from the administration to say, oh, we need to be prepared for bigger and more frequent storms, and so we need to have an infrastructure that will allow these bases to survive. I think those are probably discussions that are going on right now at the Pentagon, and we'll see. I don't know how they're going to rebuild.
Hasn't it been for a number of years, Dave Phillips, that the Pentagon is fully well aware of the threats of climate change? It's released reports saying it's one of the greatest threats to national security in the 21st century. But you still have President Trump doubling down. I mean, of course, in the past, he called it a Chinese hoax. What is the significance, the practical effect of this denial? What it means for bases like Tyndall and future ones that could be leveled?
During the Obama administration, and to an extent during the Bush administration, there was really a push by top leadership to prepare for climate change in the military. That meant making sure that bases were more resilient, that they were looking more at renewable energy and looking more at sea level change. What I've heard from people in the leadership is that push from the White House is no longer there. But there's still enough inertia within this huge bureaucracy that is the military that a lot of this stuff is carrying forward. There are a lot of smart people in the military, and they get it. They need to prepare for, like you said, a threat that right now is a much bigger threat to any U.S. bases than any conventional enemy. So I think they're still doing it, but the question is, will that speed that they carried over from previous administrations slowly diminish without leadership from the top? And we'll see. I think that watching how they rebuild Tyndall and look at other air bases is going to be a good test. But certainly there's no doubt now that these places are really vulnerable.
What most surprised you in your reporting, Dave?
So when these storms were bearing down, they brought their aircraft that they knew weren't airworthy and put them in their strongest hangars. These are hangars that had survived every storm previously. And I think they hoped for the best, and they left. And when we saw the footage from the air the morning after the storm ripped through, these hangars were just in ribbons, and you could see the planes that were sitting there now covered in debris. And I think at that point, it was not expecting. I wasn't expecting it. Obviously, they weren't expecting it, and I think it really showed how much things may be changing.
Well, Dave Phillips, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Final question, how willing was the Pentagon to admit that, nearly $6 billion in some of its most sophisticated stealth fighter jets were destroyed?
They were not willing at all. It took us doing some. They don't talk about it. It took us doing sleuthing on the ground and some math about where planes were at other bases to figure out that there were a bunch of them missing. And they still haven't given us any accounting of what kind of damage has happened.
And you saw the tails. You saw what these F-22s, you knew what they looked like.
Right. So we were able to sort of match their silhouettes in the debris.
Dave Phillips, I want to thank you for being with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, national correspondent for the New York Times. We'll link to your piece, Exposed by Michael, Climate Threat to Warplanes at Coastal Bases. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we go just 15 miles from the Tyndall Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle to Mexico Beach, Florida, which was practically wiped off the map after Hurricane Michael. On the beach, one of the few houses that still stands, and the images of it are just stark. It's known as the Sand Palace. So last weekend, we went to Mexico Beach. Democracy Now! Traveled to the Florida Panhandle, and we found Russell King there at his home, the Sand Palace. He's an attorney from Chattanooga who owns the palace.
My name is Russell King, and we're here at Mexico Beach, and we're rebuilding. And Mexico Beach is a wonderful community, great people, and I'm confident that we're going to rebound.
So your house, called Sand Palace, stands in stark contrast to the devastation all around you. Talk about how you built this house.
Well, let me say this. This is really old country Florida, where the houses were on slabs. So as you look back behind me and you see those houses, you know that they had no chance at all against the surge. When the big storm, whenever it was going to hit here, as it's hit other parts of Florida, it's going to devastate it. So that's why houses have to be put on stilts, as they say. And this house is on stilts. This
house is in many ways untouched. I mean, you have the stairs that broke away on the first floor.
The ground floor broke away.
But
it's designed to do that way. I argued with them in the beginning, surely there's a way to secure it, but there's not. The ground floor, those few feet, you give up, and you don't have it structurally tied to the house so it doesn't do damage to the house. So whatever's down there is going to be wiped away. My big Primo grill is gone, the big monster grill that it took two people to move. And this storm picked up cars, picked up one man's house and put it on top of another man's house down here. It's incredible. Mother Nature is special.
But in about a year, you built a house to withstand 250-mile-per-hour winds, Category 5 storm and beyond?
Well, we hope, and God knows I hope somehow these storms lose their ferociousness. The man that just left, you may have spoken with him, he stayed here during the storm. It's not this house, but he stayed a short distance away in Panama City. He said he'll never stay for another one again. The scariest has been in his life. We're looking right now, how do we make it even better? Because another one is coming someday.
So let's talk about that. I mean, you built this house to withstand climate change. The increasing intensity and ferocity of these storms, scientists say, overwhelmingly, that this is being fueled by human activity. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe in the Bible. I also believe in science. And I don't know what all causes these storms to be so frequent now and so ferocious, but I did read Albert Gore's book 25 years ago, and it made sense.
You're from Tennessee, though this is your beach house here. Tennessee, of course, the land of Al Gore, among others. And he's been a prophet on the issue of climate change for a long time. Yes. You're in Florida, where the governor denies climate change. You're in a land where the president denies climate change. What do you say to them?
I say look around and look at the science. Sometimes people say things politically to be expedient, but if there's a 1% chance that human activity has contributed to this, don't we need to look at that closely? And if there's scientists, if there's other data out there, I mean, show it to me. I don't know, except I see people down here hurting terribly. People have lost their homes. People have lost everything. Whatever the cause, whether it's human activity or not, to build down here, you're going to have to do more of this, and I'm going to have to do more to survive the next one. But I would hope that the politicians would do more to try to deal with what's going on. I think if we can put a man on the moon, we can solve this issue of carbon. We can do that if we have the willpower. But people need to quit denying science.
Why do you think it has happened? I mean, just down the road, I talked to a woman who is an owner of another house that did pretty well, and she talked about building to new standards, and that's why she thinks that happened. But when I asked her about climate change, she said, I'm not going there. Why is this such a politically charged issue? Why isn't this just about science?
Here's my opinion of that, and I may be wrong. They're confusing the message with the messenger. So because of the fact, particularly because Gore jumped on that issue, then everybody else felt like they had to be against it. They can't be for it. It's just like you had a lot of people against Medicare when Medicare started. And now if you say anything bad about Medicare, it's political death. The same thing should be true, in my opinion, about science. Now, my nephew built the house with me. We're partners in it. And he has doubts about it. He's a doctor that has doubts about, to the extent that human activity has contributed. And I don't know. Maybe it is a Chinese hoax. But what I'm looking at around here is not a Chinese hoax. Those are real people who are suffering terribly. And why someone would have the attitude that I'm not going to even consider it, I'm not going to even consider the possibility of human activity, but if you start talking about coal, then in an election you lose West Virginia and Kentucky and parts of Tennessee. But coal is terrible. Coal is not good. Coal, it's tough on the miners. It's one of the worst jobs in the world you can have with a survival rate. I mean, look at their life expectancy. In those coal mines, we can get other jobs for those people. They can be building solar panels. There's other things they can do. We just have to adjust the economy. There's a price to be paid for it. It was a price to be paid for putting a man on the moon. But we wanted to do it, and we can solve this, and it shouldn't be a Republican or a Democratic issue. It should be a people issue and a planet issue. That's just incredible that the greatest country in the world, we think of ourselves as the greatest country in the world, that we would fail to be leading on this issue. And there are some great leaders here. I mean, just because some politicians make political hay out of denying climate change and laughing about it doesn't mean that the rest of us can't do something. We told them in the beginning, I want a concrete house that will survive a hurricane. There went my dormers, there went my roof, there went other things that I can show you in the house that we did. Less glass, more concrete.
And even according to the new standards, they said 30-foot pilings. You went for 40-foot. Talk about the meaning of that.
Yeah, it was just a slight difference, a couple of $1,000s, it seems like, to go a little bit deeper on the pilings. Whether that made a difference or not, I don't know. 30 may have been just fine.
So explain, the first floor is not a house. It's where the water can just...
It's where we park our cars. It's a garage. And there was a storage room back there. And that storage room is gone now. It's just wiped clean, like it was never there.
Because the ocean just went through the first floor.
It took it out. And the building behind you there, where the workmen are, water was on that second floor 18 inches, they told me. 18 inches in that second floor. And we don't have any signs of water on the ground floor to see where it was, because they said it came in clean. And then the further you get inland, the more you see the marks on the walls. So we don't know where we were, except we know we lost the ground floor, and it was probably right up to the ceiling down there.
But of course, there the water just came in, and then it receded, and you had nothing there to.
Kept on going and took out other people though, and then my debris can cause trouble downstream. So that's why what we're looking at right now is how do we do things where we survive, we have the minimum amount of damage, and we don't damage other people.
You want to show me what you have inside?
The only thing that I can think of that I didn't follow the engineer's advice on was this area here. So we had an Arlo camera up there that watched the whole storm come in. I couldn't watch it. My nephew kept calling me, and I kept hanging up on him.
Because you were too upset?
I couldn't. Don't call me anymore. He called again. Don't call me anymore. He watched the pier go out. He watched all the water come in. Watched this turn into a part of the ocean. Total devastation. Probably everything you see probably is going to be torn down. This is the road to the pier, and there were townhouses on both sides of the road, all built on slab, and they're all destroyed. Not some of them, or most of them, they're all destroyed. And that's true everywhere on both sides of Highway 98. The lady you mentioned that you talked to her, don't go there, Well, don't go there. Go here. Go here. And look at that.
Do you think people should build so close to the ocean?
Ooh. Probably not.
That's Russell King. He owned and built the Sand Palace in Mexico Beach in the panhandle of Florida. It's one of the only houses to remain intact on the beach in Mexico Beach, built to withstand a nearly Category 5 storm. Russell King comes from Chattanooga, Tennessee, an attorney. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, elite universities in the United States being questioned about their ties to Saudi Arabia and its funding. Stay with us.
رسولي قوم بلغ لي إشارة إلى عند المليح الحال يا الزين وهات لي من منى قلبي أمارة نكون نعرف بها ما بيننا البين وشاهب لك إذا جواب بشارة وقال لك مرحبا عالراس والعين وإن في عندكم لقلبي عارة.
Hamoud al-Junaid, traditional Yemeni songs. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan urges Saudi Arabia to discuss who ordered the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, we end today's show looking at how U.S. universities are facing new scrutiny over their close ties to Saudi Arabia in the wake of Khashoggi's murder. Earlier this year, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited both Harvard and MIT on his first official tour to the U.S. Ahead of the meeting, MIT students presented their university's president, Rafael Reif, with a stack of petitions protesting bin Salman's visit.
We're here because we want to urge President Reif to reconsider the meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. We're aware that this meeting is going to happen, but we feel that accepting resources from somebody in sort of a blanket way, without acknowledging that there is a substantial famine being caused by Mohammed bin Salman in Yemen, goes against the principles of MIT, which is sort of wanting to maintain human rights.
Both Harvard Provost Alan Garber and the MIT president, Rafael Reif, met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi officials later publicized the meetings on social media in a move critics say was used to give the Crown Prince legitimacy. Meanwhile, Yale University Law School's Abdullah S. Kamal Center for Study of Islamic Law is reportedly funded by a Saudi potentate. And the University of New Haven in Connecticut has formally partnered with King Fahd Security College in Riyadh since 2016. When the partnership was first announced, University of New Haven President Stephen Kaplan said, quote, "We're excited to put the University of New Haven's world-renowned programs in criminal justice, national security, and forensic studies at the service of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's next generation of security professionals." Well, Democracy Now! Reached out to Harvard, to MIT, to the University of New Haven, and Yale University Law School's Abdullah S. Kamal Center for Study of Islamic Law. None of the institutions accepted our offer to join us on the show today. But for more, we are joined by two people. In Boston, Massachusetts, Jordan Katz is with us, Department Fellow in Systems Biology at Harvard Medical School. He wrote an article for The Guardian on Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Harvard MIT. His piece, focusing on the kingdom's close ties to U.S. universities, is headlined, "Elite Universities Are Selling Themselves, and Look Who's Buying." And in Hartford, Connecticut, we're joined by Stanley Hellers, Executive Director of the Middle East Crisis Committee, also a member of the Coalition to End the U.S.-Saudi Alliance. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Yarden Katz, let's begin with you. Explain your response when you heard about what happened to the Washington Post columnist Khashoggi, the latest news, Turkey demanding the Crown Prince come clean on what he knows and who ordered this murder. Your response to that and how this connects to your protests.
Right. So I think it's important to emphasize that the protest started before the Khashoggi horrific murder. So when bin Salman was being greeted as a reformer when he visited the United States in the spring, he was visiting Harvard and MIT as well. And already a local anti-war group here, Mass Peace Action, was protesting the visit. They said, we don't want this war criminal on our campus. The problem is that we didn't really know when to protest because the universities kept the visit so secret. So my colleague Griff Peterson and I, who I wrote the piece with, started investigating it, and we found that bin Salman was going to be hosted by the MIT Media Lab, which is one of the school's most famous laboratories. And that visit was kept very secret. People in the lab were told that if they want to access the lab that day, they'd have to go through metal detectors, but they weren't told why. And bin Salman on that day received demos of the latest technologies at MIT. He met with leading university officials. He was demoed war technologies such as autonomous robots, and he signed many new partnerships with these universities, and also his visit signaled the continuation of existing ones. So already back then, students were protesting it, activists were protesting it, and even after lobbying, Cambridge City Council passed a resolution condemning the visit and condemning the way that MIT and Harvard handled bin Salman's visit and greeted him as a kind of reformer as opposed to the war criminal that he is. So the Khashoggi affair obviously has reignited interest in that, but it's been going on since March.
And you suggest that not only didn't they publicize the visit, you're saying they tried to cover it up, Yarden.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see the contrast in the way that these elite universities talk about their partnerships with the Saudis and the way that Saudi Arabia talks about it. So whenever you have a partnership like that with an elite institution like Harvard or MIT that has a very progressive and techie image, the Saudi government uses that on social media. They use it to sort of create the illusion that they're really also a progressive government, that they're really on the same page with MIT, that they superficially use the same language. On the other hand, universities haven't said much about it. They only put out a press release after the fact, and they're trying to minimize that because I think they realize that it doesn't look good. Here you have a representative of an absolute monarchy coming to campus. There's a devastating war in Yemen. Activists are being silenced and thrown in jail in Saudi Arabia. So it's not a good situation, and universities know that viscerally, but they want the money and they want the prestige of affiliating with these groups. I'd also like to add, though, that this is not just a Saudi issue. It's really, we're not saying that universities like Harvard and MIT are so ethically pure that they shouldn't affiliate with the Saudi government, but rather that universities, as a matter of routine practice, form unaccountable partnerships that are negotiated in secret with many dubious actors. Sometimes it's a foreign government, like the Saudi government, and sometimes it's a dubious American actor. So, for instance, MIT has numerous partnerships with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, who are weapons manufacturers. They are the biggest suppliers of weapons to the Saudi government. Their weapons are being used in Yemen. So the school bus that was demolished earlier this year, where 40 Yemeni children were killed, that attack was enacted using a Lockheed Martin-made bomb made in the U.S. So that's an American partnership that's also problematic and tied to this web of unaccountable partnerships that universities form all the time.
How did MIT President Reif respond to you, Yarden Katz?
I think that's a great question, and it's very telling, their lack of response. So we had a piece that was published in The Guardian. It's a pretty visible venue, obviously. After our piece, the MIT student newspaper, The Tech, published a very forceful and very perceptive editorial talking about MIT's hypocrisy and the gap between its espoused ideals of making the world a better place and its reality of hosting a war criminal. Then there was the Cambridge City Council resolution that I mentioned that was passed unanimously, also condemning the universities. And the sad reality is that the universities didn't have to confront any of this. They didn't respond to the Cambridge City Council resolution. They didn't respond to our piece. They're generally unavailable for comment. The only response was MIT President Raphael Reif writing an op-ed in the student newspaper in response to the editorial, basically not engaging with the issues and just saying, look, universities have to make compromises. It's a balancing act, and we prefer dialogue over no dialogue.
The Assistant Vice President of Communications at Harvard University, Melody Jackson, declined her offer to be on the show, but she did send Democracy Now! A statement that read in part, as a global research university, Harvard has a broad and robust scholarly engagement in the Middle East, including in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and has benefited immensely from the intellectual contributions of Saudi-based individuals over the years. We're following recent events with concern and are assessing potential implications for existing programs, she said. Now I want to turn to the University of New Haven in Connecticut. Stanley Heller, you're Executive Director of the Middle East Crisis Committee, also a member of the Coalition to End the U.S.-Saudi Alliance. Talk about what happened at UNH and at Yale.
Good morning, Amy. We have been alarmed for about a year and a half that the University of New Haven has a program, kind of secretive, we don't know exactly what it is, to have its Henry C. Lee College that specializes in forensic and police work helping the King Fahd Security College. And this is a college where all the police in Saudi Arabia go for training. We wrote to them. We had a letter signed by nearly 50 prominent Americans telling them, warning them about Saudi Arabia. We got no response at all. So that was about a year ago. Then the Khashoggi killing, and we started wondering what is going on. And the Turkish sources started leaking, that the alleged killer was a man named Salah al-Tubaigi, a top forensic scientist. So we're starting to think, forensic scientists, that's some of the things that Henry C. Lee College is famous for. And we did some poking around on some Saudi websites, and we saw the editorial board of a Saudi forensic society had on it Henry Lee and a Dr. Salah Tubaigi. This was extraordinary. And so we send out press releases and been trying to get some response to the university. The university, in a year and a half, has never said a word to us, but they do say some things to the media. The first response was, well, we're told that it's a different al-Tubaigi. The spelling is different, and so on. That seemed pretty odd that there'd be two Saudi top forensic scientists with the name al-Tubaigi. So we wrote to that society and asked them, is there a second al-Tubaigi? A Hartford Courant reporter also did the same and never got a response. And then just a couple days ago on that editorial board page in English, Salah Tubaigi's name was removed. So we think that theory of the two al-Tubaigis has been put to rest.
Stanley Heller, we have to break. We have to break, but we're going to do part 2 of this. We're going to post online at democracynow.org. We've got to end the show. Stanley Heller, Executive Director of the Middle East Crisis Committee, and Yardam Katz, Department of Fellow in Systems Biology at Harvard Medical School. Tonight, Juan Gonzalez will be speaking at Rutgers University, moderating a discussion in New Brunswick, New Jersey at 7 p.m. with Oscar Lopez Rivera and Puerto Rican scholars Ivana Costa Lespier and Johanna Fernandez. That does it for the Rebroadcast. We have a job opening full-time broadcast engineer here in New York. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.